Good morning. My name is Vaughn Bell. I am the senior pastor of the Triumphant Church of God that meets here in Westerville. And so I have been asked to kind of serve as the MC for this morning. And so as the MC, it is truly my honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce to you our presenters for the day. This morning, Mr. Jim Mulholland is self-described as a 58-year-old privileged white man with an 11-year-old black daughter named Ella. Being Ella's father forced him to confront the privilege and racism within himself, his family, and society. Jim has journaled about these realizations of racism in his blog, Note to My White Self. And he has accepted his responsibility to expose and challenge privilege and racism whenever possible. Presently, Jim serves as the executive director of Companion Community Development Alternatives, and he has a wonderful wife. He has 6 children and 11 grandchildren. That's a lot of children. So Jim will be a presenter this morning. Also, Ms. Cherie Bridges-Patrick will be a presenter this morning. She is the founder and administrator of Paradox Cross-Cultural Consulting, Training, and Empowerment, LLC. True to its name, Paradox seeks to make the familiar strange by changing what we know and the ways we talk about race and racism through social coaching, social change coaching, consulting, and workshops. Ms. Patrick is an adjunct professor for the Simmons College School of Social Work online MSW program. She's also a member of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church here in Westerville, where she has facilitated Lenten reading groups around race-related issues and advises on their refugee engagement and support work. Cherie also is a co-convener of the Becoming Beloved Community Task Force in the Diocese of Southern Ohio of the Episcopal Church, where they brought the church together to help congregations develop ways to heal from racial injustice and grow as a community of reconcilers. She received a Master of Science in Social Work from the University of Tennessee, a Bachelor of Social Work from Capital University. She has an Associate of Science degree in Organizational Leadership from Franklin University. And next year, in 2019, she will receive her PhD. So we are excited about that. If you've ever gone through the pain of a PhD, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. And then my co-presenter in our afternoon session is Dr. Margaret Kohler. Dr. Kohler is a professor of English here at Otterbein University. She earned a BA from Wesleyan University in Connecticut and a PhD in English literature from Emory University in Atlanta in 2003. She has taught here at Otterbein since 2004. And with 2 colleagues, she co-founded a new race and ethnic studies minor here at Otterbein. She is especially interested in the work of truth and reconciliation about the history of racial inequality and violence here in the U.S. She has 2 sons in Westerville schools, and she is committed to their generation having a race-conscious and anti-racist education. So those will be our presenters for not only this morning, but this afternoon as well. And so as we go throughout the day, sharing with one another, I would like to remind us all that our theme for this morning, which is the title, is Finding Comfort in Discomfort. And so at some point throughout the day, most, if not all of us, will probably experience discomfort in some way. And what we want to challenge you to do or invite you to do throughout the day is, instead of pressing down, tamping it down, instead of ignoring it and pushing it away, we want to invite you today to embrace your discomfort. And instead of trying to gloss over it, let's press into it and ask the deeper question of, why does this make me uncomfortable? Throughout the day, you may experience some kind of trigger. If you're white, the trigger you may experience may come around dealing with issues around racial inequality and how you may have inadvertently contributed to that. If you are a person of color, you may experience some discomfort. There may be something that triggers in you and by trigger I mean a strong emotional reaction to something that you are hearing and experiencing. And so as a person of color, you may hear something said and you're really thinking to yourself, well, man, isn't that obvious? How could you not know that? How could you gloss past that? And so we want to encourage everyone today, let's be patient with one another. On page 11 in the program that you received as you came in are kind of our guiding principles, our guidelines as to how we will interact with each other, the ground rules for our conversation and time of sharing today. And most of all, we listed first that we will honor the dignity and humanity in all. If we do that, then we'll have a great day together. So again, thank you all for being here. So it's already a success. Mary Beth, it's already a success. And so at this time, I would like to present Mr. James Mulholland and Miss Cherie Patrick Bridges. Oh, just James first? Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Jim, and I am a recovering racist. And if we were in a RR group, which unfortunately I don't think exists right now, you would all say, "Hi, Jim." That's right. As a recovering racist, I need to speak first and foremost to the people of color that are gathered with us this morning. And I need to ask for your patience one more time. You spent your entire lives listening to white people, mostly men, talk at and about you and your situation, and that's about to happen again. And I appreciate how frustrating that can be. I've raised 5 teenagers, and I know how it feels when they share some idea that they've recently heard from one of their peers, a truth that I've told them repeatedly, which is suddenly a brilliant idea. And when it comes to discussions on race, white people are like that. It isn't valid until we hear another white person say it. Now, I hate that. And please know that I am not here this morning as an expert on racism. While I have participated in racism all my life, I have been largely oblivious to it. This does make me, however, an expert on white ignorance, white indifference, and most of all, white resistance. So what I say today is less pontificating and more an act of repentance and contrition. I'm a recovering racist, speaking to what I hope are other recovering racists, and probably some racists that are still in denial. And having sat with friends in AA meetings, I know that this talk must begin with the 4th step, which is searching and fearless moral inventory of myself. So here it goes. I want to deeply apologize to those who I have directly or indirectly intentionally or unintentionally harmed by my racist words and actions and attitudes. And I want to pledge to honestly examine my past and present and future actions and to listen to the real experiences of people who experience racism. And I will listen to the point of view of people of color and assume that they are right. I promise to act on what I hear and learn, becoming an opponent rather than a participant in systemic racism. My white friends, I hope you share my apology this morning. Because apologizing doesn't come easy for white folk. And we've been able to avoid it for hundreds of years. And like most recovering racists, I once thought that apology unnecessary. I didn't think I had a race problem. For the first 50 years of my life, I thought of myself as colorblind. And though I had only a few friends of color, I considered them proof of my enlightenment. And while I realized vestiges of racism remained in our society, I thought that white supremacy was the behavior of a few miscreant white people. And like many, I considered the election of Barack Obama evidence that racism was largely a thing of the past. Indeed, until a few years ago, I would have been offended if anyone had accused me of being racist. Now, today I understand that most racists are blithely unaware of their racism. By allowing the term racist and white supremacist to become synonymous, we've robbed people of color of the language to call out the daily microaggressions of systemic racism. And we've created the illusion that white people who do not use the N-word and who are critical of those who do are the pinnacle of racial enlightenment. We've excused ourselves from having to examine our deeply ingrained prejudices and ignored the evidence of our privileges. You see, most white people in America are convinced racism is not our problem. Now, this deception is at the heart of the racial divides in our society today. Indeed, Dr. King once wrote, "Shallow understanding of people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding by people of ill will." Now, I want you to think about that. According to the black man that I most revere, the white supremacist wasn't his chief concern. He was worried about people like me. He went on to write, "I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate." And hear his criticism: "who is more devoted to order than to justice, and who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." He's talking about me. And like most racists, I have long thought that the lack of tension around race was evidence that racism was rare. And that's important to remember today when so many are critical of the divisiveness and negativity in our conversations. They're only negative for those of us who don't want to see a problem. And they're only divisive because they disrupt the closely guarded white consensus that racism really isn't an issue. The white person who refuses to see the racial injustices built into our society is blind, and that is not a good thing. Ironically, I used to think that being colorblind was a badge of honor. It never occurred to me that this was the only situation where I considered blindness, literally or metaphorically, as a positive characteristic. Indeed, if I had been physically colorblind, I would have thought it a disability. Yet I had convinced myself that not being able to see the color of another person and how that impacted my attitudes and opinions and actions, that was a positive. And this blindness allowed me to miss countless examples in my personal life and the world around me where blatant and systemic racism negatively impacted people of color. And even more damning, it allowed me to obscure all of the ways in which my whiteness evoked power and privilege. Now, unfortunately, I do not stand before you today as one moved by the words of Dr. King, or changed by listening to people of color, or provoked by careful study of slavery and white privilege. When you do not perceive a problem, you do not seek a solution. I stand here today aware that if not for a single event in my life, I might have continued in my self-assured confidence in my self-righteousness. I stand here today because on November 6, 2010, I became the father to a black daughter named Ella. And being Ella's father changed my life. Now, this is not to suggest that having a black child or a family member or a friend automatically infuses your life with racial understanding. Indeed, I became Ella's father when she was 3, and I told Ella's white mother and my new bride that as a parent of previous children, I brought considerable expertise to Ella's life. Apparently, I also brought considerable arrogance. I made my claim completely unaware of how different and difficult it is to parent a black child in the United States. And it would be over a year before I became fully aware of my lack of preparation. My epiphany happened on a spring day in 2012 at an elementary school in Speedway, Indiana. On that day, my wife and I took our 4-year-old black daughter to visit the school where she would be attending kindergarten. And we wanted to see the building and the classroom and meet the principal and the teachers, so we called and requested a tour. And when we arrived, the white principal ushered us to her office and began to tell us about the school. She went into great detail about their special education programs, how they were highly rated, and how they attempted to incorporate their special needs children into the general population of the school. And then she took us on a tour of the building. And we made a brief stop at the kindergarten class to observe the class and the teacher, and then we made a much longer visit to the special needs classroom. And the teacher greeted us warmly and engaged with Ella. And then they escorted us from the school and thanked us for coming. And as we walked away, all 3 of us were on edge. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until that afternoon when my wife and I had time to talk that we realized what was wrong. The entire special needs class had been children of color. The principal had assumed from the moment she saw our daughter that she would be a special needs student, that she was less capable. And realizing what had happened, my wife and I were enraged. My wife said, "She will go to that school over my dead body." Regrettably, we responded to racism by using our privilege in the worst possible way. We took our daughter and fled to another school system. We did what white people can always do. We removed ourselves from the tension of racism. And I'm ashamed to admit that we never thought to use our privilege to challenge that principal or the superintendent. We did what white people have done for centuries. We abandoned those children of color to their fate while we protected our own daughter. Friends, much of what I've learned about racism in my life, I've learned from having my white privilege exposed. You know, it's interesting, when I tell this story to people of color, they generally begin shaking their heads the moment I mention the principal's accolades for the special needs program. They know what's coming. But when I tell this story to white people, they, like my wife and I, often don't make the connections until I talk about the makeup of the special needs class. And they often respond with disbelief, saying that I must have misinterpreted the principal's remarks and misunderstood her intent. And that is the problem with systemic racism in America. Unless you directly experience its ugliness, it's far too easy to discount. Hearing is not believing. Most white people, upon hearing stories of racism, instinctually doubt and dispute them. And when we acknowledge them, we imply that they are an oddity rather than a common occurrence. And seeing is not believing. When white people see videos of unarmed black men who are shot and killed by police, many do not see that as evidence of racial inequity. Many white people say, if you're doing nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear from the police. And this is such a powerful argument because it's experientially true for us. If you've never been a target of systemic racism, it seems imaginary. There are more comfortable explanations for what you're seeing. And this has been my chief frustration as I've talked with white people about racism and white privilege. There is no adequate replacement for experience. If you assume you're colorblind and society is generally fair, it's easy to ignore the evidence to the contrary. And sadly, it often takes an epiphany. Like all epiphanies, that day at the school changed my understanding of the world. Vicariously, for a brief moment, I experienced the pain of millions of parents of color and what they've experienced at the hands of white folk. After all, there's nothing worse than watching your child misjudged and mistreated. And if one such moment could so enrage me, I could only imagine what repeated experiences of such diminishment must cost people of color. For me, racism was something glimpsed from the window of a train, there and then gone. For people of color, racism is like being tied to the tracks and crushed by the car after car after car of a long freight train. My vicarious experiences of racism through my daughter have given me a rare window into a world that most white people never see. It was a world I needed to understand, both to be a good father and to be a good person. Embarrassed by our ignorance, my wife and I began to seek out other windows into this world through books and stories and movies, documentaries, lectures, and many, many conversations. And on that spring day in 2012, I began a journey that has led me to become an advocate for reparations. One of my earliest readings on this journey was Ta-Nehisi Coates' letter to his teenage son, Between the World and Me. It seemed fitting as I struggled with what it meant to be a parent to a child of color to read the thoughts of another parent of a child of color. Reading such a book isn't comfortable for a white person. Since white people were not his audience, there was no attempt to assuage our tender sensibilities. It was eye-opening in all the cultural references I didn't understand. He was talking about a different world, though obviously a world that existed in parallel with mine. Frankly, white people are idiots when it comes to race in America. I don't use that lightly. We're idiots. We don't know the history of slavery. We don't understand how horribly black people were treated for generations. We don't realize how deeply embedded racism is in every one of our American institutions. We don't appreciate the tremendous wealth that's been stripped from people of color and bestowed upon us. Not only aren't we taught the truth about race in America, we're actually taught a false narrative intentionally designed to eliminate any guilt and escape any responsibility. Most of what I thought I knew was wrong. So let me mention some of the most problematic misunderstandings. I didn't know that slavery, as it would come to be in America, was a new version of slavery, unlike anything the world had ever seen before in its brutality and dehumanization. The slavery that developed in the New World was industrial slavery, where people were understood as commodities to be owned and sold, and this is the most important, used up and discarded. I also didn't know that industrial slavery was largely driven by the sweet tooth developed by middle-class Europeans, and that Haiti at one time produced most of the sugar necessary to meet this demand, and that enslaved persons were absolutely vital to this endeavor. 500,000 of them. And so let's be perfectly clear. Over time, millions of black people were ground up in the gears of industrial slavery so that white people could have dessert. I didn't know that in 1791, during the very years that our U.S. Constitution was being written, nearly 500,000 enslaved black people in Haiti successfully rebelled and established the second oldest democracy in our hemisphere. In 1791, everyone in the world knew about this. Today, most white people have no idea. I didn't know that Haiti at that time was considered the most valuable real estate in the world. And I didn't know that this island of rebellious enslaved people defeated 3 armies, 1 English and 2 French. The cream of Napoleon's army defeated. I didn't know that these events created such a fear in the United States that the slavery in our nation would forever be enforced by the most horrible kind of violence. And that we domesticated slavery in the United States, allowing black men and women to marry and have children, not as an act of kindness, but so we could create their families as hostages in this horrible act of industrial slavery. The violent abuse of people of color is foundational to our country's origins. Physically abusing people of color is as American as baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. Indeed, it came before all of them. Now, I knew that slavery in the United States was driven by cotton, but I didn't know that the emergence of the United States as the wealthiest country in the world was directly connected to our ability to produce cotton with enslaved labor. I didn't know that the cotton plantations were far less like farms and much more like concentration camps, where black men, women, and children were worked to death. I didn't know that the Civil War was about freeing black people from torture. I didn't know the history of the Reconstruction of the South, which should really be called the re-enslavement of black Americans. I didn't know that we had black senators and representatives in Congress in the 1870s, and that for a brief moment, people of color experienced hope. For a brief moment, our country actually was talking about reparations. I didn't realize that the KKK was created precisely to destroy that moment. And I didn't know how many thousands of people of color were murdered in the 10 years after the Civil War in order to restore the status quo. I didn't know that slavery didn't really end until 1940, that most African Americans were economically enslaved through systems of sharecropping, industrial chain gangs, and vagrancy and employment laws. And I didn't understand that lynching was the way this system was enforced, terrorizing any person of color or white person who challenged the status quo in any manner. And I didn't understand that lynchings were events where white families brought their children and a picnic basket designed to enculturate racism into their white children. And I didn't know that the last mob lynching in America happened in 1981. Now, I could go on and on and on about the things I did not know, and if you come to the workshop this afternoon, we'll cover some of that. And I wish I could say that this ignorance wasn't intentional, but I've also discovered that the whitewashing of slavery continues today with our children. In 2015, the Texas Board of Education introduced new social studies curriculum that came under wide criticism for its whitewashing of the brutalities of slavery in the American South. And one of the more damning revisions was this statement: the treatment of enslaved Africans varied. Some slaves reported that their masters treated them kindly. And let's be perfectly clear. That is racist bullshit. An honest statement would read, in a vast majority of instances, enslaved people were brutalized, raped, tortured, and forever separated from parents, spouses, and children for the economic profit of their white abusers. Citing exceptions to this rule can have only one purpose: to diminish the horrors of slavery. Owning another human being was never an act of kindness. Considering another person your property has always been evil. Indeed, the inclusion of the term masters in a modern textbook is blatantly racist. Those who owned slaves were not masters. They were monsters. And most white people will be more offended by me calling white people monsters than by what those white people did to black people. Unfortunately, the whitewashing of slavery is epidemic in America. In conversations about slavery, I often hear white people comment that there were black slave owners, as if this rare exception somehow proves that slavery was less horrible or perhaps even justifiable. And these types of statements are designed to misrepresent the realities of slavery. Imagine for a moment if someone said, the treatment of Jews in death camps varied. Some Jews reported that their guards treated them kindly. Even if this was true in some odd and rare circumstance, such statements are morally abhorrent. They misdirect and obscure, allowing the hearer or reader to avoid what we're talking about today, being uncomfortable. The history of the treatment of people of color by white people is horrific. And anyone who examines this history in any detail will quickly conclude that society owes people of color reparations. There's a horrible debt. I've come to the conclusion that if you want to quickly determine if a white person in the United States is comfortably racist, you can determine it with a single question. Ask them, should our nation pay reparations to black people for the enslavement, mistreatment, and economic exploitation of them and their ancestors over the past 400 years? And if the white person immediately rejects that proposition, and most do, you can be fairly confident that you've identified a comfortable racist. On the other hand, if they're willing to give this question serious consideration, which it deserves, you probably identified an ethically responsible and racially conscious white person. And it's really that simple. There is no compelling argument against the payment of reparations. The studies and research have been done. The historians, economists, and ethicists have spoken. While there can be and should be debate over how reparations should be made, any white person who argues against reparations is either ignorant, immoral, racist, or all of the above. And additionally, if you encounter someone opposed to paying reparations, you can be fairly certain that they will offer one or all of the following arguments. They will say, I have no responsibility. Neither I nor my ancestors owned slaves. And though I doubt most of these people have the genealogical evidence to support that claim, it would be irrelevant. The economic advantages of slavery were not limited to slave owners. Though the highest concentration of millionaires, and this is mind-boggling, in the United States in 1840 were in Mississippi, the wealth created by slavery flowed north to textile mills and banks and ultimately to every white family. Cotton was the single greatest economic driver in early American history, and without millions of hours of slave labor provided by black people, the American economy would not have thrived. The affluence generated by this labor, though unevenly divided amongst the white population, was limited to white people. You didn't have to be a slave owner to benefit from the enslavement of black people. You only had to be white. Indeed, this reality fueled the strong support for defending slavery during the Civil War. Though only a quarter of Southern whites actually owned people, all of them were keenly aware of the benefits slavery produced. Indeed, at the time of the Civil War, enslaved people constituted the single greatest financial asset in the United States. While it's certainly possible to argue that some white people benefited more from slavery than others, it's difficult to argue that even the poorest white person received no benefit. And it's irrefutable that the chief producers of all of this wealth, this immense wealth, black people, received absolutely no financial benefit. And more damning, in 1865, when they were freed from legal bondage, they were paid nothing. No back wages, no reparations. Most black people were left so destitute that they quickly became sharecroppers, which was often even more economically oppressive than slavery, if you can imagine. For these reasons, the huge disparities in accumulated wealth and economic status between white people and black people today have their roots in historic injustice. And those who argue against reparations because they or their ancestors didn't own black people are like those who fill their homes with property that they know was stolen. They may not be thieves, but they're hardly examples of integrity. When forced to face this reality, opponents of reparations usually offer this second argument. Well, that was wrong, but it was a long time ago. I haven't directly benefited from racial injustice. You know, once we've established the incredible injustice of the past, we have two choices. If we're ethical white people, we take responsibility for the actions of our ancestors. If we're immoral and racist, we throw our ancestors under the bus. We argue for our blamelessness. We pretend the oppression of black people ended in 1865. We ignore the evidence that all white people living today have directly benefited from racial injustice. You see, as lucrative as slavery was, our ancestors were not the greatest beneficiaries of the oppression of black people. The single greatest economic increase in American wealth was not the 1800s. It happened between 1940 and 1970 through programs like the New Deal and the GI Bill. Billions and billions of dollars of wealth were created, and a vast majority of this wealth was intentionally limited by governmental policy to white people. Think about this. If you're white and you bought a home or grew up in a home purchased between 1934 and 1977, which I'm sure is some of us in this room, you likely benefited from government programs that awarded millions of tax subsidies solely to white people. And if you inherited a home purchased during those years, you reaped the spoils of racial injustice. If you, your parents or grandparents went to college between 1944 and 1964, you likely benefited from government programs that excluded black people from millions of dollars in educational grants. And if you, your parents or grandparents have received Social Security benefits, which is nearly all of us, you have likely benefited from a program that initially excluded up to 65% of all black people. It is difficult to find a single government policy between 1877 and 1977 that didn't give either preferential treatment to white people or exclude black people. Indeed, most white people today are recipients of one of the greatest governmental affirmative action programs in history. And since any argument for equity would require an equal distribution of this governmental largesse, we can fairly say that the greatest recipients of racial injustice are not long-dead slave owners, but middle-class white people today. Now, when forced to face this reality, those who oppose reparations usually default to a third and more racist response. They say, well, that wasn't fair, but what can you do? You can't just give black people money. They just waste it. Or some other generally disparaging remark about black people. You see, once we've established the incredible injustice of the present, we have two choices. If we're ethical white people, we take responsibility for the injustices of our present system and we seek to rectify them. And if we're immoral and racist, we throw black people under the bus. In arguing for their inadequacy and incompetency, we verify our ancestry. Like our forefathers, we justify the oppression of black people with the same paternal, racist rhetoric. And we miss the obvious. Once you've acknowledged that the resource was stolen, what the victims do with the compensation is irrelevant. It's their money. You know, it's time for white people who are ethically responsible and racially conscious to voice our support for the payment of reparations. And it's time for our nation to financially pay its debt to the black people upon whose backs we built the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. And it's time to ask black people to tell us how they want us to make those reparations. It's far past time. And when some people complain of the injustice of it all, before we laugh, we who are ethically responsible and racially conscious must identify that opposition for what it's always been: racist and immoral. Now, like any recovering racist, I am passionate about exposing what once held me in its grips and calling out what others ignore and justify, recognizing how uncomfortable this is. But I was blind, and now I can see. And I can see the ugliness of my racism and white privilege and the countless ways it did and continues to do damage to others and also to myself. And I understand that I can no longer tolerate even a little racism in my life. I do not want my daughter to grow up in a racist home. But more importantly, I do not want anyone's sons and daughters to grow up in a racist society. It has to end. It has to end now, with my generation, with me, with you, with us. And if that doesn't make you a little uncomfortable, nothing will. Thank you. At this point, I'm going to invite Cherie to join me. We're going to move over to these chairs, and we're going to just have a conversation. This is not scripted. I have no idea where it's going to go, and that's part of what we want to model. How do you begin to talk about some of these deeply uncomfortable things?
So, thank you. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little warm. That was heavy. And I want to start out by saying...
Can you move it closer? It's really not picking you up very well.
I'd like to start out by saying, giving a statement by Lila Watson. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Okay? And I want us to walk away with that, because you're not here to help me. You're here to help you and us. Okay? So, yikes. You talked about so many different things, Jim, and you already said that this conversation is unscripted, and I'm a little nervous about this. Can you talk about, so let's talk about reparations and your experience in putting your program together.
Okay.
And you and I have been talking, we've had some conversations along the way, and we thought it was a good idea to just speak about those experiences. And thank you. And you shared that you went to produce this workshop, and you got some pushback from some folks, and that kind of, I don't know, it sounds like it may have kind of caught you off guard. Yeah. And so would you talk about your experience and just give us a little background on that?
Yeah. First of all, I need to say that I had not really thought about reparations at all until I read an essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates called The Case for Reparations, which I'd highly recommend. After reading it, I blogged about some of what I shared this morning and ended up writing 3 blogs about reparations. Those blogs exploded. I normally have several thousand readers to my blog. That blog had 150,000 readers. So I knew something was going on, that this was an important thing to be talking about. Also got tremendously negative feedback, as you can imagine. Fortunately, on my blog, I get to approve whether someone's comments are added, and that was very important during those weeks. But out of that, I also began to connect to lots of people around reparations. Had a pastor asked if I would come and do do a workshop. And I had not thought of that and said, why don't you make this a workshop and do it for our congregation, an all-white congregation, which I did. And that was a very interesting experience. In the end, very positive, but it was a learning curve for them and for me. After that, that pastor kind of put the word out and said, well, Jim did this, he could do it for your congregation or group, who's interested? And Mary Beth is the only person I think who actually responded to that. There wasn't a lot of interest, people very afraid of that conversation. And so then I proposed it to a conference that's in Indianapolis called Spirit and Place, and they do very interesting similar things. So I proposed it to them, and they rejected it. And the response was interesting. It was a selection group that included people of color, and they said, you need to have a African-American co-facilitator. Well, that was a struggle for me because, this is really a workshop designed for white people. And I'd read quite a bit from people of color who said, this is something you need to be doing with white people. You need to be talking to them. So to hear this back, I was like, well, how do I handle all this? But as I said early in the talk, I have decided that any time a person of color says something to me, I'm going to take it really seriously. So I said, okay, I need to work on this. And so I began to talk to lots of different people and said, I need to find a African-American co-facilitator. Well, it turns out that the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, NCOBRA, their national co-facilitators in Indianapolis, wouldn't you know? So I got connected with her, and so she arranged for about 20 members of their organization to allow me to do the workshop for them. And so I did the workshop for them. It was a very powerful experience, and I realized I got a bunch of things wrong that they changed for me and helped me sort through. One of the things I learned, just to show you how insidious this is I used the word slaves. And they said, you can't use that word. He says, that objectifies us. It makes us, it separates us from being people. It allows you to escape the fact that we're people. And, I had to go back and work on this talk because I had used the term slaves. And even as I speak it now, when you call them people rather than slaves, there's a difference. You didn't own slaves, you owned people.
Humans, yeah.
You own human people,
Yeah.
yeah. So, so at the end of the presentation to NCOBRA, they said, no, we think you can do it without a co-facilitator. Frankly, we're tired of talking to you white people about this. And we seldom get anywhere. And they said, they're going to listen to you better than they'll listen to us, which I think is sad, but there's some truth to that. But the other thing they said, which was really important, is they said, but every person of color should be suspicious of you. What right do you have to speak about our story? What right do you have to speak about our situation? They should be suspicious of you. And so that was really helpful for me to understand that in these conversations, I think white people often want to be treated with a respect we have not earned. And that we need to accept that any conversation with a person of color, we need to accept that they should rightfully be suspicious of us. And that even after they learn to trust us, they should rightly be corrective to us. Because we will continue to say racist and troubling things. And you and I have had some of that experience just preparing, having you call me out. And just a few years ago, if you'd called me out, I would have wanted to distance myself from you and been upset at you. And now this has taken a lot of work, but I'm actually to the place, Cherie, that attracts me. Because it's, well, here's somebody who can really help me change this, because I don't want to be this way.
Right.
I don't want to say these things.
Right.
That's a long answer to that question, but I know you wanted me to talk about that.
I wanted you to talk about that, and I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how it felt to be accountable to a group of black folks who, from your location, from your position as a white man, Could you just give a little bit of feedback about that?
Well, they didn't say anything for the first 45 minutes I was giving the workshop, which was frightening,
Yeah.
you know, because I thought, oh, I have really screwed this up, and I'm in big trouble. And about 45 minutes into the workshop, they all started raising their hand. I thought, oh, here it comes. And they began to correct me, rightly so. Said, well, you got this wrong, and they got this wrong, and they got this wrong. And then we began to continue through the workshop, and then they were very quick to stop me at lots of different points and say, no, that's not exactly, or you forgot this, you know, here's all these different things. And I'm writing notes furiously. And then somewhere in the middle of that conversation, they must have forgot I was there. Or they finally decided that I was legitimate enough to have an honest conversation, and they began to talk to each other and began to talk about white people and their experiences and their deep frustrations and deep pains. And Mary Beth was the only other white person who was there. And I don't know how Mary Beth experienced it, but it was incredibly humbling and also incredibly embarrassing. No, that's not the right word. Shaming, you know, to hear things that I realized they talked about together all the time, but never in front of white people, you know. And I remember one man saying, why would we want to integrate with white people? You know, why would we want that? They keep offering that out as some great prize. You know, we're going to integrate with you. You know, why would we want to integrate with you? And I'd never heard a person of color say that, you know, and it was like, yeah, I get that. I'm not sure why I would either, you know. And there's this sense of recognizing that most of the conversations I've had about race have been so surface level, you know, that I've been getting what black people assume I can handle, which is very little, and that I don't know. You know, it was like when I read the book Between the
World and Me.
Between the World and Me. There were parts of the book I didn't understand.
Yeah.
I just didn't get it. He was talking about something, and I thought, I don't know I think I'm a pretty smart person, but I don't know what he's talking about. I don't understand the cultural references that he's making here. And I don't think white people get that there's this parallel existence that we are, to some extent, closed off from, and that would force us to have to revisit who we are if we heard it. You know? Let me ask you a question. So we said we wanted to do both back and forth.
You know, I'm trying to get out of that.
How did you feel at the end when some people applauded for what I was talking about? How does that feel to have this story talked about, number one, by a white person, but I mean, how do you feel when someone applauds that? I know I felt a little odd. How do you feel about that?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because I've had this conversation with a couple people over the last few weeks, and the first thing that comes to mind, or that came to mind when you were finished, is that I'm not your entertainment.
Right.
Right? My story and the story of my people, I'm not your entertainment, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I started off with using that Lila Watson quote.
Right.
Because it is so very important for people to, particularly white people, to find a place in this story, the story of race and racism, right? Because the ways that we talk about it, we put a lot of distance. And so, you know, you're able to go and try to understand the black experience or the experience of someone who's not white. I don't need you to understand my experience. I need you to understand your role in my experience, and then we can talk about my experience and yours, so that we can start to, you know, to address these things. And so that, I felt a tinge of that. And I quite honestly, there are times when I have to distance myself from that truth in a place like this in order to hold on to my sanity. Right? Because when you think about all the things that were said, you know, the historical legacy that's been that we are living in, it's painful. You know, And so I put a little distance in that for my own sanity.
Yeah. That's interesting. It reminds me of a recent conversation I had with an African-American woman, very accomplished professor, very well-spoken, and she said that she had recently traveled to Africa for the first time, and when she got off the plane, she said it was as if this huge burden that she'd never realized that she'd been carrying just fell from her shoulders. This burden she realized that she carried all her life. To suddenly be in this place where everybody was her skin color and there wasn't any white people around at all. And she said she experienced two weeks in Africa that just this incredible freedom. And she said the minute she walked on the plane to return to the United States and saw the white stewardess, it came back. And that just, to realize that most white people, I don't want to say all, there are burdens we carry as well, but most white people navigate our society without much on our shoulders at all. The whole system's designed for our ease and comfort. And to recognize suddenly that there's all these other people that don't experience that is again, my white privilege has been how I've come to understand my racism as much as anything.
So I think we both have touched on our experiences, as we learned each other, as we prepared for this day. And you mentioned me calling you out. Do you remember that day?
Yeah, I did. I can remember that.
So we were having a Zoom conference, and I had prepared, the Zoom link and everything for us to join. And like 5 minutes before we were to get on the Zoom conference together, I get this email from Jim, and it says, "Here, we can use mine. We can use my Zoom link." And I thought, oh, okay, well, this is interesting. I wonder what this is all about. And so, we got on the Zoom, and then I think it immediately.
I took over. I just started talking, I just took over the conversation.
Yeah, and I thought, well, now this is a really good time to try this thing out, because we're gonna sit in front of an audience. Let's see what happens now. So I said, what just happened here? I had this link all set up, and at the last minute you changed, and I'm kind of noticing that you're taking over. What is it? Is race, gender, what's going on?
I said, absolutely, it must be those things, And, again, in the past, I would have immediately excused it. Well, my Zoom lasts longer than yours, I've got the special Zoom.
Sure.
Or I'm just a take-charge guy. I'd usually jump in. But I think because of some very intentional thinking, I was able to hear what you said and think, yeah, here's my white privilege again, just exerting itself. And now, some of those other things may have been true, but they're not what drives it. And that's, I think, what's so difficult for us as white people is we want to focus on the incidental rather than this deep, abiding motivation that's within us, which is basically that I'm superior than you. So obviously it's my tools. Obviously it's my agenda that are more important.
So you're saying, So you're saying it's like this deeply embedded kind of thinking. It's a way of being, this
Absolutely.
Whiteness. Okay.
Yeah, and it's instinctual. It's at a level that I cannot. I can probably not eliminate, or at least not. No, I'm going to say that. Probably not eliminate. So what I have to move to is that place where when it's challenged, at least I don't go to the defensiveness, that I'm able to just immediately say, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Can we start over? Can you help me? And then even recognizing that in itself, and you and I talked about that, is again a white privilege. You need to help me. You're my helper. I mean, the ways in which this is so insidious in us is it's difficult to unpack.
And so when you put it that way, I'm your helper, what a lot of times happens is we kind of like go along with that, right? Because this thing is so insidious, so deeply embedded in us that we just go along. It's like I don't think about it till I get home, and then I'm mad, right? What did he do? I don't know what he's doing. So it's important. I'm glad that you talked about being intentional about this and how difficult it is about being intentional, because it is so much of our everydayness. This talk, this racial, relationship that we have, and I see it as a relationship between people and between systems. You do what you do, I do what I do, and then it just continues. And so until we just stop and say, what just happened there, makes it difficult to change.
And that's interesting, Cherie, because as you were talking, I just realized we even use that, when you help me, we even use that against you, so that the fact that you did that becomes justification for things continue. I think it's kind of like there were black slave owners. If you can kind of create this idea, on any situation, I often hear white people I'm talking with say, well, I know a black person who agrees with me. As if that one black person counteracts the thousands who disagree, so that we're looking for any justification. So if you'll help me, that somehow justifies a whole bunch of other things that I'm then able to ignore,
When you have said, and I've heard white people say that they have been told that you need to do this work yourself, right?
Yeah.
It's up to you to do this work.
Right.
That kind of scares me. I mean, it really scares me.
I can hear that.
Because, you kind of look at the history and you go, so we're going to leave it up to white folk to change this all by yourself? No.
Yeah.
So, can we talk about that just a tiny bit? Because if we continue in this way, this is never going to, we're never going to make any progress. So it's important for us to be able to say, this is a you and me thing. It's an us thing, because it functions together, and it has to be cleared up, made whole together. We can't do that. So if you were to talk to this group of people about doing their own work, what would that mean to you?
That's a great question. And I think the experience with the reparation workshop was a recognition that two things are true, that we have to hold in tension. And the one is that, to some extent, because of white power and privilege, because of white resistance and indifference, that as much as I hate it, white persons are going to have to work with other white persons around this. But that's true. On the other hand, I think what you've just pointed out is equally true and problematic, is that it's a little bit disingenuous to think that the ones who really designed and created this very oppressive system are suddenly going to be the ones who solve it and end it. So I think what has to happen is there has to be parallel conversations. I do think that sometimes white people have to be talking to white people, and partially that's because we are in relationship with so few people of color. Now, I think the latest statistics are that 85% of white people in the United States say they have no significant relationship with a person of color. 85%. If you live in an urban situation, that goes up some, but if you take the nation as a whole, so that means there's only 15% of us that are even in relationships with a person of color. So it's probably going to have to start with some conversations between white people with white people. That being said, I think the other piece of this was recognizing that what was very powerful was when I had that workshop in front of these 20 really informed and expert people around this history, that to think that I could somehow tell their story without talking to them was, again, white privilege, you know? Even though I'd read the books, you know, I did my homework, but even that, to say that somehow I can take your hard work and I'm going to use it, you know? And you and I talked about this. I mean, even today, white centering, you know, that we started with my story.
Yeah.
Now, we did that on purpose.
Right.
We talked about that and made that decision. But that's white centering,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
how often do we do that? How often do we, even in context about race, everything becomes white-centric?
Right, right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think, one, that we do need to call out whiteness, right? Because we're calling out racism as if it functions on its own.
Right.
Right, it's like, you know, those poor black people, those poor people of color, they're being harmed, and I just don't even know how it's happening, so I can walk away and, you know, and that just doesn't cut it. And so,
Yeah.
in a sense, you do have to kind of center whiteness to decenter it, because that's the big thing that I think continues the functioning, at least in one regard, the functioning of racism. And particularly the ways that we talk about race and racism, and the ways that it's so deeply embedded in our institutions, in our media, in our thinking, in our, you know, in everything.
Yeah.
So
that reminds me of something else that happened in the workshop preparation, is that I began the workshop previously by saying to white people, what do you know about slavery and racial discrimination in America? To which one of the NCOBRA people said, after we were talking, they said, that's a terrible way to start. She said, you need to ask, what do you know about the white mistreatment of people of color in America? She said, as soon as you say slavery and discrimination, you have distanced yourself from it once again. She said, you got to say, what do you know about how white people have mistreated black people? But that's that whiteness we don't want to acknowledge. We want to leave it out of the equation, you know, as if slavery and racial discrimination just kind of happen.
Right.
You know?
Right.
It's just out there in the ether, you know.
Yeah. What? If I've asked this question before, help me out. But how can white people? I mean, what is the process for starting to, you know, because it's like, you know, I call myself a farmer because I just plant seeds, and I know the rest of the work is not up to me, right? So my job is to plant seeds, and if you want to work with me, fine, let's do some work together. But in terms of the benefits for white people, you know, what is the gain?
Yeah.
What is the gain for white people in this? Because, you know, you got everything.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. I think most white people do not see any real benefit in being in relationship to people of color. So that's an act of charity, you know? Well, if I'm a good person, I ought to have some relationships to people of color. So even then, it's not from the fact that they may contribute to my life in some positive, important way. So I think at the very least, that's probably where we have to start, is do we see value in people of color? I mean, is there value in being their friend? Is there value in being in their relationship with them? Do we even understand what they might bring to our life that would be positive? That's first. And then second, how would a more diverse, inclusive world be better for white people? And I think a lot of times the assumption is it wouldn't, you know? We're giving something up for diversity and inclusion rather than we're gaining something. Now, the interesting thing is the study after study after study has shown that diverse, more inclusive groups, more successful, more productive, there's all these kinds of benefits. So scientifically we know,
Right.
but emotionally we're not there. You know?
Because I wonder, I think it's more than, you know, what's the benefit of having a relationship with a person of color,
Right.
right? Here's a question that I just wonder about what happens to your soul. It's like, is there any gain in regaining one's soul and
Yeah.
regaining one's humanity?
Yeah.
Because to me, that's what this work is about, is taking that place in humanity and really, truly becoming human in this process. Because right now, I don't know how one, treats another with disdain, regardless of what color.
Yeah.
How do you do then hold on to humanity? Something has to give there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's a real argument that that what slavery and racial discrimination in the founding of our country did was corroded the very ethic and principle that we supposedly presented. I mean, the contradiction between these beautiful words that Thomas Jefferson writes and his life. I mean, that's a huge disconnect. And so I think you're right. I mean, there's this question of what has it done to us in terms of, how we treat, other white people even. I mean, what does it do? How does it corrode that? Let me ask a question back.
Okay.
Why do you want to be in relationship with white people?
So we're being honest here, right?
I mean, that's what that guy said. Why do we want to integrate? So I guess,
Right.
I mean, what's in it for you?
Right. So, on an individual personal level, there are some days I wonder why.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't even know why I want to do this.
Yeah.
But there is something in me. I'm human. And
Yeah.
it's in this country, I have to be.
Yeah.
I don't get to escape that because
Yeah,
all the
that's right.
systems, right?
That's very, very good point.
It's not a choice that I have.
Yeah.
That part. But in terms of my own individual life, there are days that I don't want to, but then I know that because of the call that I have from God,
Yeah.
right? There's a higher thing in this for me. Because on my own, I'd be done. Seriously, I mean, I would just be done. And so it's part of why I'm here.
That's really interesting. The man in the reparations workshop who said, why do we want to integrate? And he was saying all these things, and I was a little bit frightened by it. And afterwards, he came up and he gave me a hug. And I thought that was really interesting, that I think there was these deep pains that he was speaking out of, like, I do not want to be around white people. It's just too painful. There's all these things. And yet, there was also this moment at the end where, for whatever reasons, he wanted to connect to me. And maybe that goes to what you said. I would hope that part of what our humanness is connection, that we want that, that it's valuable, that we care about it.
And so, just to sort of give a little plug for the Becoming Beloved community, that's what this is about, right? I mean, Becoming the Beloved community is about living into a way of life that allows us to really be who we were all, sent here to be.
Yeah.
Right? And so that, again, that's part of what drives me to do this, is that I'm trying to live my highest and my best.
Yeah.
And every day I mess it up.
Yeah.
But every day I get a chance to redo it. And so that's becoming beloved community. That is being who we are supposed to be.
Yeah. And this question is, are you letting the North off too easy? Blacks, Jews not allowed in certain neighborhoods, Asians banned from beaches, etc. Native Americans banned from bars until the 1970s, and we could go on and on and on about lots of other examples. I hope not. I hope I'm not letting the North off easier. I think what happened in the Civil War is a pretty good microcosm of what continues to happen. Is in the South you had, before the Civil War, what I would call very blatant racism. You're enslaving people and torturing them. That's pretty blatant. In the North, what you had was a lot of people benefiting from that system and looking the other way. And I think that pretty much describes what we're dealing with now, is that there are probably two groups of people in our society. Those who are probably blatantly expounding and advancing racist narratives, racist systems. And then there's a whole lot of people who are complicit and just looking the other way. So, yeah, I think the people who are complicit in some ways often are the larger group, in some ways are the pillars of that. So yeah, I don't want to give the North, imply that this is a Southern problem, So any of the rest of you want to respond to that? That is this a North-South kind of thing? Vaughn?
I would say we have a tendency to give the North a pass, but the North was every bit as racist as the South. The difference is in the North, you didn't see it as much as you did in the South for one reason: proximity. Because the attitude of most Northerners was actually, well, we don't like them either. And the evidence for that is what happened when the free slaves started moving north. Dr. King, when he moved his family to Chicago, said that he was experiencing racism in Chicago, the heart of the North, that was worse than anything he had seen in some of the deepest parts of the South in Mississippi. And so there is, because part of the narrative that's put forward as it relates to the Civil War is that the North, we're the good guys, and we're fighting to free the slaves. Well, that's somewhat true, but somewhat not true. Because Lincoln himself said that if he could have ended the Civil War without freeing the slaves, he would have. But wound up in a pickle in a situation where he couldn't. And so, with white privilege, he says, well, okay, then let's go ahead and let's make it about slavery. And more about economics than it was about freeing black people. And so, because of that, part of the narrative that gets communicated is that the North are the good guys and the South are the bad guys. But the North is every bit as racist as the South. And it's further evidence. We see that in the patterns of how we settle and how we live. If we're really honest, there are very few really integrated neighborhoods. Matter of fact, the statistic is, and I'll talk a little bit about it this afternoon, for whites, when 15% of the population in a neighborhood, in a community, becomes black or people of color, white flight begins. Whites start moving out. And this is not in the South, this is in the North. There have been studies done that show us that school integration never really took hold in the North at all. But in the school systems in the South, when they were under federal government guidelines, were actually way more integrated than school systems ever became in the North. And so that's a long answer, but yes, I think far too often we give the North a pass.
And I would just like to add that it's more than North and South, right? It's a U.S. regional, local, everywhere thing, right? It's ubiquitous. It's in this room. It's floating around, right? It's in the air that we breathe. And so I want us to be careful about, trying to put some distance between, if we talk about the North-South, no, let's talk about the everyday stuff that we're going through, that we experience, that we put forth in our everyday actions.
Yeah. Well, and let me say, when I use the line about monsters, I want to be careful not to suggest that the Northerners were angels. I think I'd use that intentionally, and I thought a long time about that, simply because I think we need to confront how horrible what was being done was, that it wasn't masters, it was monsters, it was monstrous in what was being done. That's not to imply that what was happening in other places, which may have been more subtle, was somehow acceptable. And I think also to use that term monsters too, because I know myself and other white people immediately get offended by that, to help us understand that we're more offended by the accusation than what was happening, and that's troubling, and I think to just make us aware.
So I'll go ahead and read, kind of stay in line. Cherie, what was it like to hear Jim describe the African-American woman who traveled to Africa and experienced being surrounded by people who were the same skin color for the first time, as educated, articulate, well-spoken?
Good point.
So,
Good point.
to point out the everydayness of this,
Yep.
I was engaged in a conversation and I missed it, right?
Yep.
It didn't jump out at me because I'm performing, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I missed it, but now that you pointed it out.
Absolutely. 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 I apologize. Absolutely.
I caught it immediately. But our workshop is also on implicit bias.
Yeah.
And so it's another one of those situations where it's so ingrained in our culture and how we are raised and the messages that are communicated to us, that, and quite honestly, as an African American male, we experience it so much in every venue just about that we are in, that to call it out every time you see it is just, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And so you get to a point to where you just say, okay, you can have that one. I don't feel like
Right.
fighting about that
Right.
today.
Yeah.
Can I throw in a comment here, please? That is that I'm married interracially, and my husband went to a school with only 15 people of color. But 5 of them were Africans, actual Africans from Africa, who looked down on the African American. So he had the prejudice coming both ways. And he said that was almost worse. You can deal with one at a time, but when you have this kind of dichotomy, where do you go?
Right.
Well, and that points out the intersectionality of when we had that conversation on the Zoom call, what of that was racism and what of that was misogyny?
Right.
You know?
Right.
I may have been acting more out of misogyny.
Right.
This idea that you're a woman, I'm more superior, I'd take the lead, So again, I think there's all these intersectionalities that we're not always aware of. Yeah.
I've got kind of a doozy. Please reflect on why the disregard of white women toward black women is so particularly painful, and how women can work independently from men to heal the relationships. What can women, especially white women, uniquely contribute to the journey? A doozy, but also a great question. And I guess I can speak mostly from my own experience and, work on transformation, which has been mostly in my career. And Vaughn read earlier that I had co-founded a race and ethnic studies program here at Otterbein, And I've worked largely with a black female colleague in my department, and that, collaboration has been so instructive for me. And I've seen, through that relationship, a lot of my impulses, my white impulses to speak first, to take credit, to want to be the public face, to feel like I know better. And over the past few years, I've had a real education, or started to have a real education in noticing those impulses, not, being derailed by them, but learning a little bit how to be in the background, how to listen better than I think I was able to before. And I've learned and gained so much from having that relationship with my female colleague. So I think, one thing white women can do is, get proximate. You used proximate before. We had Brian Stevenson from Equal Justice Initiative on our campus last year. And one of the things he says over and over is get proximate. So I think white women can get proximate without dominating, without, putting their white women's tears in the center, with listening. But I don't know. I'm curious, Cherie, what you would say.
So I think it's deeper than that. White women have played a tremendous role in the continuation of race and racism and the harms of race and racism. And so I do agree that that's the start, but it's much deeper than that. And I don't know what the answer is. You've got to look deeper into who you are, because what is happening, what we're seeing, and what we've seen, white women are in the background. They're like in the foreground of doing some of these harmful things. And so it's much deeper than proximity, but start there. But also really explore what is happening in my head that allows me to behave this way, right? And I'm not suggesting it's all white women, but because of the way we're socialized, and because of the role that you play in society, you have so much, you have a different kind of power that you exercise against us and against yourself sometimes. So I don't know. It's a really hard question, but it goes, in my view, well beyond that proximity. It goes into a much deeper place. Vaughn, you want to go next? You want to read your question?
You have a question, Vaughn, down there?
Okay. How do you navigate the tension between telling the truth about white privilege and the history of white violence to people of color in this country, with wanting to invite white people into this conversation in an easily accessible way? In other words, how do I get my white church congregation to even begin this work and not just shut down?
Well, can I start on that one?
Yes, I'll let you start.
I guess my first response is, I don't know that there's an easy way into this. And that is part of the problem. So, to some extent, there needs to probably be some initial shock. Now, I think when that happens, certainly there are people who retreat into further defensiveness and into attack. There's that fight or flight kind of thing. But I also think that sometimes that's the only way we can interrupt what's happening. And I think that's what Black Lives Matter has been largely trying to do, is they've been trying to interrupt. And of course there's been all kinds of backlash against that, but One of the things I'll talk about today is John Brown. When I did the reparations workshop for the Cobra people, about halfway through they said, "You have not talked about John Brown. You cannot leave John Brown out." And I said, "Okay, talk to me. Tell me why John Brown should be included." Because in my mind, what I was taught about John Brown, he was this crazy guy, did this crazy thing, right? And they said, "No, John Brown's the first accomplice. He's the first person who's willing to die to end slavery." And they went on to tell me that I didn't know, is that Harriet Tubman would have been with John Brown that day, but she got ill. And think about how we've lifted Harriet Tubman up. You know, almost all white people say Harriet Tubman. Well, she was an accomplice to John Brown, just happened to be sick that day. You know, and so I think there is a sense of, when I hear the John Brown story, of realizing that what John Brown did was he did some major shock to the white culture in, I think it was 1857, 1858 when that happened. And that shock did have this huge impact of forcing people to rethink, and also re-entrench. Don't get me wrong, there are people that re-entrenched because of it, but it did force people to have to revisit what was happening. So maybe this seeking an easy way for white people to confront this, I don't know. Is that just white privilege again? That if we're going to do it, it has to be done in a kind, easy way. I don't know, Cherie, you're shaking your head. What do you think?
No, it's difficult work, right? Anytime you face those dark places of yourself, it's difficult work. I don't want to look at those dark places, but I know they're there, right? And so it's not easy, and we can't have it both ways. And so you have to find inside you what is the benefit to you as a human being, to extending yourself. It's not even extending yourself, to living this life. What is the benefit to you? What's the gain for you as a person, right? And if you can't find any gain, I don't know what to tell you, But it takes hard work. You're not going to get it both ways. It's not going to happen.
No.
And that is that privilege, that whiteness that says, everything's been created for me, so this should be easy too. And it just ain't easy.
Mm-hmm.
It just ain't easy.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. It's not easy work. As a person of faith, I would say it should begin with prayer. It also will have to begin with leadership. If the leadership never buys in, it's never going to happen. It's not going to take place. I got a lot of things running through my head all at the same time. Another thing that you have to prepare yourself for is actually confronting and being honest about the part that the white Christian church has played in perpetuating slavery and racism. And that's not that's a very uncomfortable place to be. And I have this theory that there are three institutions that are very slow to change: the government, public education, or education period. That's why we're still doing school the same way we did back in the 1700s, and the church. And especially with all of the change our culture is going through today, what I have learned and become sensitive to is that people that come to church on Sunday morning or Saturday night or whenever they go, there is a sense in which a lot of people really believe and would like for the church to be the one place where they could find stability and keep things the same. My professional project for my doctoral program is on how I believe the church should actually be leading in the charge, because we have the one thing that the world does not have, and that is the gospel. That's the good news. And when we look at the gospel, if you think you're going to be a part of the kingdom of God, and it's going to be all white, if you think you're going to die and go to heaven, and when you get there, it's going to be a bunch of white puffy clouds and a bunch of just white people, you're going to be disappointed. The same if you think when you get there it's going to be all African Americans, it's going to be all black folks, and the white folks will be left. No.
In hell, that's where they'll be, right?
So how do we do that? How do we begin without shutting down? And start small. Okay, so find other like-minded people who are like you and think the way you do, and begin as a small group and watch that small group grow and expand. And now experience can help you in this as well. I know of a large church situation where diversity wasn't really an issue until the pastor's teenage daughter got pregnant by an African American teenager. And once the baby was born, who was just the apple of his eyes. And he began to hear the conversation of other people in his church as it relates to the apple of his eye, his granddaughter. All of a sudden, now, diversity became a real issue for that congregation. So sometimes God can help us along in the process. But there's no easy way to do it.
And I think we also want to be careful about being too Christocentric in this too as well, because the truth of the matter is that Christianity is one of the least integrated religions in the world. And we're very critical of Islam, but frankly, Islam is much more integrated as a religion than Christianity. So and there's something to be learned from some of these other religious traditions who have been able to handle that in a different way. And that kind of leads into a question here that I think is interesting. How quickly do you move from doing white-centric work to joint work? And I think Cherie and I were kind of talking about that. One group I'd really suggest to people is a group called Standing Up for Racial Justice, which is called SURGE. That's a national organization. I did not check, but I would not be surprised if Columbus area has one.
It does.
Does it? Okay, good. And they do ally training. They do a lot of really interesting things. My wife and I have gone through their trainings in Indianapolis. And basically what they assume is that there is a certain level of work that white people need to do initially. Some of it is to eliminate the most egregious ways in which we violate relationships with people of color, or at least to recognize them when they're called out. And then second, to give us just a basic groundwork for understanding systemic racism, which for a lot of white people is still the debate, Is there really such a thing, and what is it? So getting people to just understand that. Then, once you go through that basic training, there is the assumption that you begin to work as an ally, that you find people of color who are working on these issues, and you do what you can under their leadership to support the work. And that's really hard for white people to do it under their leadership, Again, stepping back and saying, I need to not bring my white privilege and assumptions to this work and take it over. I need to really sit and listen to how I can engage and support the work that they're doing. We go to the Black Lives Matter protests, and it's important for our daughter to be there and part of that. It's important for us to be there and part of that. They often say things that make me cringe. It's not how I would say it. I'm afraid all the other white people are going to get angry at them. I mean, there's all these things going on in my head, and then I realize I'm not in charge. I'm the follower. I'm the one there supporting their work and helping them. And will they always get it right? Well, number one, how do I judge that? But even if they don't, even if they get it wrong, I haven't got things wrong as a leader, I have. So what does it mean to really put yourself in a position of support, encouragement, validation, all of those things? So I highly recommend, if you've not done that training here in Columbus, I think it's a really good place to start. It's not where it ends, but it's a good place to start.
I'd just like to make one comment. This is just a personal issue that I have with the term ally.
Yeah.
Because that seems to put some distance between what's really happening here. Like I started with Lila Watson's statement, this work is for us,
Yeah.
right? And if you can't see your humanity, your liberation along with this, I'm not a project. I don't have to have that kind of assistance, right? I can get this wrong myself, and I can get it right myself. But I want for us to do this work together, and for you to receive your own benefit.
Right.
Right? I'm not the benefactor. I do
Right.
receive some things, but see yourself. Find yourself in this story. Find your place. Where do you stand? Because we're all complicit in some sort of way. We're all participating. And so how do you find that spot and stay there and stand there and feel it, right? So that you can move on and continue to be in your place as a human being and not just an ally to help some other folk out.
Good point. Very good point. A lot of people are moving to the accomplice language, and that still may not be completely,
Yeah.
I think it's better, but it's yeah.
That's the other thing is language, right? What is the language to bring to this dynamic? But I'll stop there.
I would just add, another thing to do is to use your privilege, use your white privilege in whatever setting you're in, to kind of elevate or make voices of people of color heard, concerns of people of color heard, can be a good strategy too.
Any more questions?
Regarding reparations, why do you think the percentage of whites increase for reparation for blacks after the Civil War?
What's the question?
I'm not sure I completely understand that question. The person who asked that, do you want to clarify?
Yeah, it's why do you think they back? I think reading some charts it would say like during slavery, the percentage of whites that were for reparation was very low, but after the Civil War, it went up.
Right.
Until more whites were against it than it was, prior to slavery.
Well, I don't know. That's a really great question, and probably worth finding some people who are looking at that. My hunch is that before the Civil War, reparations were abstract and an abstraction's fairly easy to be supportive of. But after the Civil War, it could really happen. You could really do it. And so I think for a lot of white people, when that became a real possibility that would have had an economic impact on them, suddenly they weren't nearly as receptive to it in the reality as they might have been in the theory.
And then I tied into Reverend Bell what he said when we moved into the North, when they start seeing all of this quote unquote freedom and so forth like that, that's probably why they probably tuned in and said, well, they're getting their freedom, so to speak. Why do we need to pay them? They have their
Right.
freedom, so
Right.
why do we need to make this statement, so I just kind of tied it all into
Yeah.
what Reverend Bell had said earlier.
There is also a sense in which we have to remember that even though the Civil War freed the slaves, you still had landowners, plantation owners, that still had these huge swaths of land that still needed cotton produced. So the economy was still based on cotton. And so from an economic standpoint, you have plantation owners, land owners, where under the system of slavery, they had essentially free labor that now they are having to figure out ways. Now, how am I going to get enough money to pay enough people to farm all of this land? They couldn't figure out a way to do it. So what do? You institute a system like sharecropping, where you keep the people there still producing the cotton, and you just figure out a way to cheat them out of having to pay them anything. And so I think that feeds into why the percentage of people in favor, or people, the percentage goes up that are against reparations. Because now we got to figure out, how does this work? And if these people are free, so you're going to give them something? Well, you never gave us anything. So.
I know we're almost out of time, but one other thing I want to say real quick is one of the things I learned that was a total surprise to me, and I'll just ask, how many people of color do you think fought in the Civil War? Any guesses how many that was? 100,000? What do you think? Just guessing. Yeah, it's 500,000, 500,000, okay? And we're not often told that. In fact, Lincoln actually said right at the end of the war that blacks freed the slaves, or black slaves freed. I think he actually said slaves freed the slaves. 500,000, just to put that in perspective, there was only 4 million people of color in the United States at the time of the Civil War. So 1 out of every 8 fought in the war. There were a much larger percentage of white people, a much larger population of white people. The percentage of white people that fought in the Civil War is less than 1 out of 8. So actually, percentage-wise, more people of color fought than white people. And that's just lost. That's just lost in our history, that tremendous numbers of African Americans fought for their freedom. You know, so.
But some fought for the South also.
Not people of color.
Yes. Yes, there were.
Some of them were forced to work behind the scenes, but Jefferson Davis was very clear that if they ever allowed a person of color to carry an arm, it would actually prove that they were wrong. So he was not going to ever let a person of color carry a weapon. So.